dry protection. That's been a
Yeah.
pretty debated topic, I feel like, over the last couple of years, with people trying to figure out how to make the game a little bit more reasonable, and without, but also not destroying the old school nature of the brutal going dry on things. Because I think there
Yeah.
are a lot of players that do like that system of like, you can just go incredibly dry.
Yes. I think it's something that needs a lot of careful consideration, because you don't want to start straying into the territory of things becoming too easy. And obviously that is the debate. That's the whole debate. Every poll, we don't, players, they want quality of life, but other players don't want things to become too easy. So how can we find that middle ground? So my opinion on that with dry protection is, I don't think we should have a set number or a set amount of dryness that gives you an item, for example, a pet. I don't think that's a good idea, because potentially there's where it could be abused. For example, if you've got every purple except the mega rare, if then the next mega rare you get, I just feel like I just don't feel good about that. So instead, maybe something like improving the Grandmaster achievement. Sorry, not the Grandmaster, the combat achievements, and giving us an item, for example, the Lucky Penny, in a second slot, which I've seen suggested on Reddit. I think that's a very good idea. An extra slot, and maybe making the Lucky Penny some sort of boost to RNG. And when I say boost, I mean like minimal but noticeable. So, for example, maybe let's say if you get the master achievements, so you know how like with the clues, for example, you know how you kind of have a better chance of getting a clue with each tier.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking maybe the Lucky Penny, you could, with each tier you go up, there could be some specific boost to your luck with drop rates of very rare items. So I'm talking, 2%, 3%, 5%, maybe 10% with the Grandmaster for cosmetic items like pets. And personally, I think that would be much better than having like, I think RuneScape 3, is it the drop rate of the pet? You then get the pet. Is that correct?
I don't actually really remember. I think it's something like when you do pass the rate, then it just gets easier and easier and easier to the point of like, I don't think it's even like virtually possible to go like 3 times the rate in RS3 on pets and stuff. I could be mistaken on that. I think people have told me that as soon as you pass the rate, it basically like doubles the rate afterward, and then after a little bit longer, like triples it. And
Sure. And I wonder if with the mega rares you could apply it to that as well. So maybe if you've had all purples and you use, apart from the mega rare, and you use the Lucky Penny, maybe you get a one-time significant boost to that being your next drop. I just think we need to think outside the box a bit. Those might not be great ideas, but I think it does need to be looked at, just because I think, I've had friends, Iron Man friends, who've actually de-ironed their accounts. I think a lot of max players know people who've done this with 10,000 hours, and he's de-ironed because he was so tired of going dry at chambers. 3 years, 4 years of grinding. This guy had hundreds of purples, and because he just psychologically, you just get to a point where it's just like, I can't take it anymore. I'm 4,000 hours dry raiding, and I'm no closer to getting this twisted bow than I was before. And I think the game needs to reward your time investment somehow. And I think that that's not fair on players. And no criticism on Jagex, but I do think that if I was in the team, that would be something I'd really want to like sort of urgently explore. Because personally, I've seen a lot of players get turned off the game. Max higher account players get turned off the game because of just the brutality of this game's RNG fest.
Yeah,
Is a bit much.
That's an interesting idea of a sort of luck boosting sort of token that you can equip or whatever, and maybe you can choose where you're going to use up that RNG that maybe it like recharges over however many bosses you kill or something. I do sort of like that. I don't know how it would function mechanically, like for example, like if you are just missing one item, what is it exactly boosting if there's a boss that has multiple drops, and how
I'm gonna
are
be
you
honest.
yeah
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest, I haven't thought this through very well. but I
you're
wanted
just
to
saying,
bring an
generally
idea.
speaking, is something that can boost RNG of things that maybe
Yes,
you're dry on, is what you're considering. And then
exactly. And
they can work that out, obviously, like in detail later. But you're just throwing out ideas.
yeah, exactly. Like leave it to Modash, he'll come up with something
Yeah.
hopefully. But I just think that a second slot. I've seen this idea on Reddit, so I'm copying this from Reddit. A second
Hmm.
slot that you can put the penny in. That's a great idea. And then I think over across the board, a lot of people agree that combat achievement rewards are slightly underwhelming. Um, why don't we make the lucky penny actually lucky? That's my concept. And
Mm.
like what you said, you can play around with it, you can tweak it. But I think it's actually quite important for the integrity of a game that some people might say, no, I don't like that. It's reality. You should grind. There's drop rates, and you get it when you get it. And if you can't take it, you can't take it. But I think it's nice for people who maybe don't have as much time or don't want to sink 4,000 hours into raids to get one item, to just have that little bit more RNG, 15% plus 15% chance of that T-bow one time or
Yeah.
whatever it is. I just think that needs to be implemented somehow.
Because I've heard many ideas. I've had many guests on where we have talked about dry protection, and I think just never make any actual item that is a part of your arsenal. And what I mean is like an actual weapon upgrade. So I'm not talking about cosmetics or jars or third age or anything. I'm talking about things that are like upgrades to your equipment to kill other bosses. And obviously there's probably like some gray lines of what that exactly means. But generally speaking, any boss like weapons or gear or raids items should all be in a certain hour range efficiently of obtaining. And I think one of the mistakes that Jagex made, and this is just my opinion, is making Chambers rates incredibly absurd. And there's a few reasons for it, probably, which is one, it was the biggest piece of content and the only huge raid in the game at the time. And putting all those hours into the development of the raid, they wanted it to be camped. Like they wanted people to invest hundreds of hours into this place. And if Raids 1 had come out after a plethora of other raids had come out prior to it and a lot of other bosses, I don't think they would have felt the need to make the drop rate so absurd. And I think when we look at it, we have so many different paths in this game now to take to get different gear upgrades, especially if you play an Iron Man, you can see how many different routes you can take to build up your gear set. And I think Chambers really just needs to, I've said this before, it sounds radical, but like really, I would just love to see Chambers drop rates be doubled across the board and just have some rebalancing with scaling. I think just generally speaking, doubling the drop rates and if that means maybe reworking how the prayer scrolls are given, maybe making it so like CMs don't even give prayer scroll drops. So CMs are really where you're kind of getting the more big ticket items. You just have a much better chance. But just across the board, doubling those rates, making it so a T-bow being, I want to say, generally speaking, if you're an average player that's jumping into raids, if you're going for a T-bow, that shit's going to take 600 hours on raid because you're not doing it efficiently. You're going to die occasionally. You're going to be spending time scouting. There's a lot of hours that are just kind of sunk without like calculating it efficiently. But even let's say a T-bow is 300 hours efficiently, and I know you can make it even more efficient if you're doing mega scales or 3+12s or whatever the hell people are doing these days. And by the way, I would love that to be sort of reworked as well, making it so any sort of scaling does give you a pretty decent chance. I don't like the super warped scaling where it almost feels like you need to do a certain scaling because it's so much better for purples.
Sure.
But generally speaking, if you were to just rip the Band-Aid off and make it so drop rates are genuinely within the range of, and I will throw out hours. Like I really do think no item in this game that is a weapon or a gear upgrade should ever be over. I used to say 250 hours, then I dropped to 200 hours, and now I am saying 150 hours. Anything, and I'm talking about efficiently. So you could be a noob and it could still take you about 300, 400 hours, but efficiently, I don't think any singular item in this game that's not purely cosmetic should be over a 150-hour grind. I think that's the absolute cap we should ever like hit.
I think that's very reasonable. I especially I think it's very important the context you added with when the content was added because it, like you said, it was the first raid. they were expecting it to be just piled on. Maybe the only raid they might not have even had plans for raids 2 at that point. So yeah, I think the drop rates are aged. They're aging badly, and you can see that with the Iron Man accounts that are going 4,000 hours dry for a Tebow. So yeah, I think you're right in that potentially just making things more common and just accepting the hit to the price of the items is probably better for people's experience of the game. I do think overall, and even if things are more common, you're going to have more engagement with players because they're going to have the gear that they can use to get to the good bosses faster, and there'll be less risk of them burning out in the mid to late game, which happens quite a lot, especially with Iron Men, because they need the item drop. So I really like your idea, and I like the idea of scaling down the hours, because it's like we shouldn't have an item that you can go, even 1,000 hours is ridiculous. That's a huge amount of your own time.
Yeah.
150 hours, even 250 hours, I could kind of go with, because 150 is fair. But I like your idea of making it more common, and I think the only downside would be obviously that items would crash, like big ticket items. People might not be very happy about that, but I think overall it would be better for the game to adjust those rates. And I guess
they do have some systems in place. One of them is just item syncing, like Grand Exchange item syncing. Like they really can manipulate the market in a way where certain items are sunk more. They already do it with mega rares and other raids items and other big ticket items. I also think that sort of rebalancing how raids works could also address some of those issues. So for example, like prayer scrolls not even really being given to CMs, maybe rebalancing how points are given. So solos and other just basic small teams are giving you actually a decent amount of points, because it really feels like just running basic trios without scaling it is just a total waste of time at Chambers. And I'd love to see them sort of just switch that up a little bit, make it a little bit more fair across the board. There's a lot of discussion to be had and a lot of like balancing with that. But one of the things you would see is just basic supply and demand. I mean, if all of a sudden the rates were doubled and people started grinding it, the GP per hour would just, drop. And then at that point, people would jump to another raid, and they would jump to Toa, which, by the way, if you look at Toa, if you look at Tob, they're way more reasonable already. Like on release, they were much more reasonable to get a drop. Like Scythe, these are kind of older numbers, but what used to be the sort of general range was a Tebow was about 400 hours and a Scythe was about 230 hours, even on release. Like that was kind of the general sort of how long this takes. And again, like those hours are way different depending on gear these days and the metas and whatever else. But it was already almost twice as common to get a Scythe. It was just seen as the harder raid, sort of. And then you got Toa, and like people, if you're good at Toa, I mean, getting a Shadow, especially before the drop rate nerf, that was even more common than a Scythe. Like you could just kind of go get a Shadow. And I feel like those raids are more in line with the hours that are appropriate. And I feel like Chambers, we just need to rip that band. This is my opinion. They need to rip that Band-Aid off. It's the same thing. We're going to talk about Nightmare in a second, but like the same thing with Nightmare, where they've repeatedly been ripping off these little Band-Aids to make it actually a reasonable piece of content, and it's still not at that place, in my opinion. And Chambers, it's like, dude, what are we going to do when Raids 4, Raids 5, Raids 6 comes out? Like, are we going to, until the end of time, just keep digging our heels into, no, the drop rates of Chambers are fine the way they are and never change them? It's out of control, I think.
Yeah, I do think definitely they've done a lot for Cox, but the one thing they need to change now is the drop rates, and the scaling is great. I do agree with that. And I just quickly, before we move on to next, on this point of sort of old updates kind of causing issues, the drop rates, I think a good example for me as a pet hunter is the drop rates of God Wars dungeon bosses. Because, in my opinion, 1 in 5k is just insane for those pets. And I get it. Like, I've locked myself to this way of playing. I get it. I shouldn't be moaning, but I am. Because 1 in 5k is if you think about going dry, which is quite a fairly good chance of going dry on that. I think in this example, God Wars was a very early update, and they weren't expecting. I think one of the mods even said, I can't remember which one, that we weren't expecting people to collect all the pets. We didn't think you'd be crazy enough to go out and grind 20k bandos to go dry for a pet. So when they were releasing these things, they weren't having balance in mind. You know, these were one of the only bosses dropping pets at the time. So they were like, okay, 5k, we'll make it a super cool item. And at the time it worked. But now, not so much. And I think it's just similar to Chambers. These older updates, they do have some issues with drop rates, I think.
Interesting. So I've never been necessarily a pet hunter. I think I have like 32 or 33 pets on Sae Bae, but I really just kind of played the game a lot and I just ended up collecting pets anyway. But
Yeah.
I don't, so maybe I'm not totally qualified or totally like in the pet hunter community to really understand how other people feel about it. But at least personally, I have never felt like pet rates need to have any real changes to them. I do understand the standardization. I feel like there is something to be said about pets these days being more about 1 and 3K, and maybe they could just look at just changing those old pets. Like I could see an argument that I could potentially agree with of just kind of standardizing pets across the board, like DK's pets being 1 and 3K, God Wars being 1 and 3K. But my general sentiment is that anything cosmetic, being pets or third age or any like jars or anything like that, never needs to really be addressed because it's not like an essential upgrade. It's purely cosmetic, and it's purely like if you decide to be the masochistic player that wants to do some crazy grind that you could potentially go super dry on.
Yeah, and that's fair. And I think that's why I just think it would be neat if, you know, for example, I actually think like I agree with you that pet rates are fine. The only ones I would change are God Wars to 1 in 3k. That's my personal opinion. I think 1 in 3k would be a lot more reasonable.
What about DKs? Do you feel the same there too?
I think DKs is okay because you
Okay.
can kill them so quickly, and I think that's okay. I mean, yeah, maybe, but the thing is, this is. I like the idea of this penny because then maybe you can imbue it for one boss, just for for your whole account history, and get a bit more luck on one of those cosmetics. But like you say, it's if you look at the pet hunters community, it's not that big. I mean, there's a few hundred people actively grinding for all pets, and we've got much more important things to address. It would just be nice to kind of have a slight buff in a place where you really needed it, I suppose. But that's just my perspective.